So the clip you just saw from the Colbert Report is perfect because it shows at the same time the reverence, but also the satire that comes together in keeping this image alive in the minds of people through being cited in popular culture. And what you see here is another example. Sesame Street, the children's television program, did a series of specials in 1976 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of American independence. And in one episode, George Washington crossed the Delaware to surprise the British. Sometimes the homage turns to the sarcastic. This one, for instance, was given to me by a friend who had served in Iraq as a medic. So he knew full well what it looks like to be on a battlefield and to not just fight, but rather to patch up the people who are hurt, who are wounded or killed. Now, one of the things that the curator from the Metropolitan Museum of Art did not go into is that the original painting was located in this structure, the art museum in the city of Bremen, my hometown. I was actually born and raised half a mile from this spot, which goes to show just how global a picture this is. Why in this location? Well, the original painting that Leutze created in his studio in Düsseldorf was heavily damaged in a fire, and they were able to carry it down, and you saw just how large this canvas is. So it took several people risking their lives in that fire to carry it down the stairs. But the smoke damage was such that they had to claim the insurance money, and under the laws at the time, for the payout, the insurance company owned the painting. So Leutze started from scratch, and the version he completed as the second version, that's the one that's hanging in New York in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then there is one more smaller that he also painted from his own hand, which is located in a country club in Los Angeles. Now, the original that had been damaged was restored. The insurance company restored it at their own cost, at their own expense, and then put it up for auction. And the merchants of the city of Bremen, who were building an art collection for the public in this museum, purchased it because they had long-standing ties to America. They were the first Europeans to trade with the independent United States because the British were no longer available as a trading partner for a while. And so by the time the Civil War came around, Bremen was buying a full third of the tobacco exported from the United States, as well as a decent share of the cotton, nothing close to Great Britain, which bought 2/3 of American cotton, but up there with full nation states like France and so forth. So all the details by my book. Anyway, but this is another part of the story which really, in a very sort of dramatic way, shows the entanglement of this picture, as well as of the United States, with the global history of this age of self-government, democracy, and so forth. This original painting, which had burned once in Düsseldorf in the studio, burned another time, and this time for good, on September 5th, 1942. So all we have left of it is this black and white photograph from an archive. And it was destroyed because the museum was hit by a firebomb dropped by a British airplane in the bombing campaign against German cities. So by a British airplane, yeah. There was strange irony involved in this. Now, let's return for comparison purposes to the city of Washington, D.C., whose architecture and layout, likewise, are supposed to make a statement about George Washington, as well as about what America is all about. And if you paid attention to what Stephen Colbert was saying, Washington was laid out by a French guy. He was a military engineer trained at one of the famous schools of various military sub-disciplines. They had artillery and pioneers and so forth, fortress builders that were being trained at these schools in Paris. So here was one who had come with the French troops that helped the Americans, and who was friends with George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. And this Frenchman was intimately familiar with the way that Europeans had been building cities to represent ideas. He knew Versailles, he knew Rome. So what flows into the street grid of the city is precisely the awareness of how others have done it. So the Americans are building a republic in 1776. And when they built Washington, D.C., it's already 1790. There are no other republics around on that scale. Everything that there is monarchies. And the monarchies are very good. Like I said, in Versailles, you're going to spend several quality minutes traveling through a large sculpted park, being able to contemplate the majesty of the king, whose palace fills up your entire field of view and just gets bigger and bigger as you approach it. So you're very small and very overwhelmed by the power that resides there, by the greatness of the power by the time you get there. And they want to get the same effect in the way that they set up Washington, D.C., except that the power is of a different kind. It's the power of the people. Here, you have the Capitol building at the bottom of the picture, and you see quite nicely how all the main streets in the city radiate away from it. Meaning that not just if you're on the National Mall, you get a good view of the seat of the people's representatives, but from almost anywhere in the city. You're never far from a street corner where you get a view of the Capitol, which also sits on a hill. So it's the hill plus the cupola. You can't miss it. The architecture of the Capitol building, the architecture of the Washington Monument, that obelisk. And by the way, the White House would be over here on Pennsylvania Avenue, off to the side. So it's got a nice piece of real estate, but again, it is not on any of the main visual axes that define this grid pattern. And then in the end here by the Potomac River, that's where you have the Lincoln Memorial. But all this architecture of the Capitol, of the museums, of the Smithsonian that line the National Mall, with few exceptions like the Aerospace Museum, are built to copy in their style the architecture of ancient Rome. And in fact, the language to call the place where the Senate and House of Representatives reside, the Capitol, copies the Roman Republic, not the Roman Empire, but before Rome declined and strong men rose to power, like Julius Caesar, and then worse to come, Nero, who famously played his fiddle and wanted a nice backdrop that was dramatic, so he had the city of Rome set on fire for dramatic effect as he played his fiddle. Or Caligula, who appointed his horse to the Senate of Rome as a senator. And they got away with that because by that time, the political system and the dominant forces had given up on self-government, and they were just, let's go the authoritarian route. But before that, there was a republic. And a big part of political science in the 18th century is about how do you keep a republic from deteriorating, where it goes down the path to empire and autocratic rule. Oddly enough, ironically, American conservatism is obsessed with this process of the decline of a republic to the point where they don't see it when it's happening and they're the agents of that decline. But I digress. So you have to go back 2,000 years to find an architecture and a political system that can serve you as a model. That is how revolutionary this republic is. There is simply nothing in the intervening time that comes close to the ambition. And so for that reason, the capital has its name and its architecture. It's almost a carbon copy of the seat of the Senate of Rome, which is also called the capital. And so the layout of the city of Rome, the broad thoroughfares, the visual axes, the monuments to political and military leaders, all of that is what is copied here in Washington, D.C. And in doing that, and here's another nice view that emphasizes the way that the city is put together to give you good visuals. And here too, by the way, this is this body of water. The photograph is taken from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial towards the Capitol, down all the way down the National Mall. The body of water in the foreground is called the reflecting pool. It exists for no other purpose. It's very shallow. It's like a foot deep. It exists for no other purpose than to provide the viewer who is standing in this exact spot with two rather than just one views of the Washington Monument. So what this demonstrates is the power that shaped this space, can use space for purposes completely, in and of itself, this is a waste of space. You can do that to emphasize the splendor, the power, the symbolic value of the monument honoring the father of the nation. So you try that at home. You can't. That's the point. And by the way, this is the same spot where Martin Luther King stood when he delivered his famous "I have a dream" or "I had a dream" speech. Now, this style of building that you see evident in Washington, D.C. is called neoclassicism, because the classical antiquity, that is Rome, that is Greece, so it goes back to that. This is something that is very popular during the Enlightenment. As you recall, after you get humanism in the 1400s, or the scholars from Greek-speaking Constantinople flee from the Ottomans, they move to Rome and Florence. They bring with them the knowledge and the actual texts of ancient philosophers that were burned and forgotten in the West. And this sets Europeans on track for a scientific revolution, for a philosophical revolution that culminates in the 18th century in the Enlightenment. This idea that you do not need kings to do your governing for you, and you do not need priests to do your thinking for you, because everybody can do that on their own. Famously, John Adams said, when we write the Constitution, we're reducing politics to a science. And by reduce, he didn't mean to debase it. Reduce more like you do a reduction when you do a sauce. You boil it down to the essence so that it's easier to handle. If you boil politics down to the essence, anybody can understand what's going on. The king speaks in very cloudy language. If you remember the Treaty of Paris, before you get to anything specific, there's endless language designed to emphasize just how high and mighty and noble the signatories are, how important they are. And it's designed to keep lesser beings away. We don't want you to meddle with our politics, with our statecraft. You have no business. You're subjects. You're not citizens. So if you make a republic, You want government to be plain and simple, easy to understand, because people have a stake in it, and not many people, but some people, the property, have a say. So you need to understand it. And what better way to understand it than with your rational mind? And what signifies or symbolizes the power of reason better than geometry and mathematics? So the aesthetic represented in this architecture is the conviction that rational form, clear, transparent, symmetry, and so forth, that is the highest form of beauty, of aesthetic, because it is transparent, it is clear, it is Republican, it is democratic. It can be understood by anybody. So government doesn't hide behind images of bishops and emperors and fierce-looking gargoyles and other monsters and ornaments all over the facade that serve to dazzle people. And you don't know what you're looking at. You don't know who these emperors and bishops are, whose statues you're looking at, unless somebody explains it to you. And if you're a peasant, nobody is going to explain it to you, if you even ever get close to it. Here, anybody can walk up right to the steps of government and will be immediately clear what's going on here. This is where the power of the people is at home. This is from where it radiates to shape the land after rational principles and as an exercise in self-government. So this is a vision of America as a system of government that is immediately expressed in this architecture. It's about reason, it's about enlightenment, and it's about self-government. And the architecture, just like Washington crossing the Delaware, is a monumental painting through its sheer size. So the architecture here is monumental. As architecture, it serves a particular purpose for people, but it also serves to make a case. Now, the Washington Monument in the middle is just monument, plain and simple. But the Lincoln Memorial, you go there to commemorate Abraham Lincoln and to celebrate his achievement of ending slavery. The Capitol building is simply a workspace. There's offices there, there's a cafeteria, there's an underground subway train that shuttles senators and representatives back and forth to their off-site office buildings. So it's architecture, it's for a purpose, but it's also a monument. So it combines these things. But all these ideas of reason, of the power of people to shape their own destiny if they act together, of self-government and popular sovereignty are coming under attack at around the same time that Washington is being built. The French Revolution that began in 1789 with the same ideals that the American Revolution stands for has taken a dark turn after 1795, when the most revolutionary, most democratic elements in France lost a major political battle. And from that point onward, a very small group of wealthy people take over the revolution. They govern in a tightly knit group of 3 people, and eventually one of them, Napoleon, declares himself to be Emperor of France and sets up autocratic rule. Still, he is fighting in all of Europe against governments that are not based on the rule of law. So the main accomplishments of the French Revolution to clear out of the underbrush of laws and rules and customs of the feudal order is maintained and driven further under Napoleon. So Napoleon still poses a threat to every petty despot any prince and an emperor and king across Europe who wants to rule, not just in an absolute fashion, because Napoleon does that too, but without the rule of law and without modern law. So Napoleon remains a force, a revolutionary force to reckon with, a force for good in Europe. And had he actually won, we would probably have been spared some of the worst of the history since then. But many people came to the defense of these monarchies that Napoleon and the French Revolution threatened, saying that, in fact, the people don't have any business governing themselves, and they do not understand statecraft, and they will drag religion to the ground if they think they can figure out what to believe without the help of a priest who has some authority over it. And these people we call reactionaries. A reactionary is somebody who wants to go back to the time before 1776 and 1789, who rejects the fundamental assumptions of that age of revolution. And just like the revolutionaries use art to make their case, so the reactionaries do. And here you have a fine example of a reactionary painting, a Frenchman who was opposed to the revolution, who moved to Rome and who painted Rome not as it was in the ideal of the Roman Republic, that the architecture and layout of Washington, D.C. recreates, but Rome as it looks in 1800. And here, the buildings, the marble facades, all have a patina, not white and shiny anymore. The people, the descendants of the mighty Roman Empire that used to rule the world, if you notice them, they're just lounging around, being lazy, certainly not going out and conquering the world. If you've heard the saying, all roads lead to Rome, that is because the Roman Republic and the Empire built a network of highways across Europe that were so well built that people were still using some of them in 1800. Nobody was able to build roads that good until in the 18th century, a Scotsman named MacAdam started experimenting with paving, with pavement, and came up with some innovations here. And then the French under Napoleon implemented some of that as well as their own ideas in recreating on a larger scale what hadn't been done since Roman times, a road network that truly connected the entire continent. And the reason they did that was because they wanted to march their armies halfway or all the way across the continent and back on a regular basis. But here, the road, you see, is rutted and unpaved. So this also makes a statement saying, you Romans who thought you conquered nature by building these roads, nature, the forest, is coming back. The road is gone. There's dirt left with tracks in it. And of course, the scientific and rational conquest of nature is always associated with skepticism about religion. If you know your Roman history, what you see here is the heart of the trust of Romans and Greeks in reason. The figure is the goddess Minerva, also known to the Greeks as Athena, namesake patron of the city of Athens. She is the goddess of science, learning, wisdom, knowledge, and those kinds of things. The Romans, who built individual structures for each god and goddess, built this temple in a prominent place to Minerva. It is one of the most important deities in Rome. And when Christianity took over, the Christians did not tear down the temple. They appropriated it, and they slapped on top of it a bell tower, saying, "This is now a church. We won. Your gods have no power. Our one God is the one true God." And this signifies the triumph of Christianity over ancient polytheism, and it also symbolizes the victory of revealed truth over reason, over scientific. So this is the program of a artistic movement that goes up against the neoclassicism, which you saw in Washington, D.C. And these two competing artistic movements, classicism on the one hand and romanticism on the other, fight alongside political movements, of course. Classicism we associate with the revolutions of the day. Romanticism works for the reactionaries. But classicism says that reason is the capacity that gives humans insight into the world. Romanticism says, forget it, feeling is the only way that you get to truth. But classicism says, by applying science, by applying our reason through science, we can understand the world and then use technology to shape it. Romanticism says, science leads us away from truth, which is rooted in feeling. Intuition leads us back to nature, away from the artificial, and therefore the rejection of reason, the rejection of science and of technology, which is truly the province of humanity. Everything else, what classicism, what the revolution stand for, is probably of the devil. God is to be found in communing through our feelings with nature. But what these movements have in common, if you look at the names of them, is that they both talk about the same material. They both talk about Rome. Classicism, as I said, classical antiquity is about Rome and Athens. Romanticism has the name of the city Rome, Roma, in Italian, in its name. So this is also about Rome. It's about Rome after the fall of the empire. And classicism is about Rome before the rise of the empire. But they're working with the same material. So what you might have figured out by now is that the city of Washington and its architecture is part of the classical artistic project. But the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware is part of the Romantic school of art, Romantic landscape painting. And this should give you pause, because if Romanticism is part of the movement to fight against the revolution, if it's reactionary, how did that come to represent America? And in order to get an answer to that question, we will be taking a closer look at Romanticism. And we will be doing that in the next part of this lecture.